Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you some more about priorities in chess. And let me go straight to the first example to demonstrate what I mean. Here we go. In this position, Black clearly has a superior position, having a rook versus a knight, which is obviously a more valuable piece, and in addition, having an extra pawn. Now, what's important to know about these type of endgames is that if you have a knight against a rook, if you defend correctly, it's an objectively drawn endgame. However, in this case, Black still has a pawn. And of course, that's extremely important because if Black succeeds to keep his pawn on the board, of course, with the help of the rook and his king, should win the game easily under normal circumstances. However, in this particular position, if White plays correctly, White will succeed to capture that very only pawn of Black's. The correct move for White here is, and the only correct move, to move the knight to c3, attacking Black's pawn on a4. And here is the moment when I want to tell you about priorities. Because here Black has two choices. Black can try to advance his pawn forward or try to protect it. Now, you may notice that if you advance your pawn, your opponent has an unpleasant check, forking your king and pawn, which means that if your king is in check from a knight, it needs to move out, and then the white knight is free to capture the pawn, and White achieved his goal as of capturing your last pawn. And while Black still, of course, has winning chances, and if you're Black, I definitely suggest you try winning because your opponent may not defend precisely and may make a mistake, and then you can still win this game. However, among grandmasters, such an endgame would be a draw almost all the time. However, after knight c3, you may notice that after pawn push, you lose your pawn, and you may think, oh, but how about if I protect my pawn with my rook? It's very important that you don't stop looking for your opponent's good moves after each of your attempts to make a good move, because then you would notice that the same check coming with the knight to b5 is even more unpleasant, because then when the king gets out of the check and knight captures rook, Black no longer has any chance to win, really, because after pawn advance, the white knight can easily and conveniently either going to c2 or even to b3 control the key promotion square of the black pawn, and the white king can come close and do the same. So therefore, in this position, for Black, the priority is making sure they do not lose their rook. And after White plays knight c3, Black may advance the pawn or may just advance his king, realizing the fact that Black is losing the pawn no matter what. And then, on one hand, either try to trap the knight or try to create a fork or a skewer, a pin over the knight, or in fact even try to checkmate White's king by getting close with your own king, the black king, and try to squeeze the white king down to the edge of the board, pretty much just as if White wouldn't even have a knight on the board. Of course, because they do have that knight on the board, White objectively can save the game, but only if they play precisely. Let's move on to our next example in this lesson and look at a different priority. In this position, if you're playing black, you may notice a very tempting looking move, and that is to create a pin over the white rook and queen. You'll notice that if the white rook now moves away to most of the squares, black would simply capture the white queen on f2. That is, for example, if rook moves to d5, bishop captures queen, and of course that's horrible for white. But what happens if that rook moves away to some different squares? For example, moving to c7, counterattacking black's queen. That would be a poor choice as well, because the black queen would simply capture that rook while at the same time protecting the black bishop on b6. How about if the white rook moves to e5 with hopes that if now the black bishop captures the white queen, the white rook would also capture the black queen. In this case, the problem is that black will capture the white rook anyway, even though the white knight is protecting it, because then at the end of the day, black again won a rook. A bit better would be here for white capturing the black bishop instead, but nevertheless you can see that white lost a 5-point piece versus a 3-point piece. So therefore that's a 2-point gain for black. So is bishop b6 a good move? Not quite, because white has an even better move. Can you figure out what that move is? And that move is to capture the black rook. And the reason why that is such a good move, because it's a check. And therefore, black doesn't have time capturing white's queen. On the other hand, after rook takes rook, not only that white saved his own rook, but in fact white is the one winning material by capturing the black bishop on b6. So what's the moral of the story? That when you see a good move, make sure you look out for your opponent's best possible response, at least that you can see. Because in this case, if black foresaw white's optimal response to the black bishop now moving to b6, he would realize that it's best not to try to pin that white rook right away, but perhaps move the rook away and maybe see if white falls for it later. So in this case, it was a priority not to put your own bishop on an unprotected square with bishop b6. Because while it looks like that black tricked white, in reality, black would fall into a trap, in this case, of white. Let's move on to our next example. And here we go in this position. Let's evaluate the position. If you look at the material on the board, you'll notice that each side has a queen. Each side has a pair of rooks, but black does not have a piece similar to white knights. Also, each side has 5 pawns, so white simply has an extra knight. Therefore, in this position, white has a clear material advantage. But what should white play here? While white certainly has many good moves, the most tempting looking, giving a fork, would be a serious mistake, a big, big blunder. Did you see the move I'm talking about? That's the move, moving the knight to d5. It looks like it's an awesome move, attacking black's queen and rook at the very same time. The sad part is that this move allows for black to checkmate white. And that tricky move is to move the queen down to f1. And it's white who got the checkmate. What's the moral of the story again? It is to make sure before you make your own move, you look out, see if you left any entrance point for your opponent, a serious threat such as checkmate or your queen hanging or anything similar. The main thing is to always look out for the best moves of your opponents, not just of your own. Getting back to this starting position, what should white do? Well, there are countless good moves here. For example, capturing a free pawn on d6. Or white could do the same, capturing with the queen. Or even attacking black's queen and then exchanging a pair of rooks would be quite a good choice. However, you surely would want to avoid moving your knight to any square. Let's move on to our next example. In this position, it's white's turn. And again, white has a very obvious looking, tempting tactic. You can notice that the black king and queen are on the same diagonal. And that calls for a way to make a pin. So there is a very tempting looking move to pin the black queen and king. However, what I'm trying to point out, the priority is to avoid a tragedy, and getting checkmate obviously would end the game. And in fact, that bishop move that we just made for white would allow for black to checkmate immediately by moving the rook down to e1. And it's game over. Now, if you notice what the danger is, why it's not good to move your bishop to pin the black queen, what should be your next thought, the next game plan? Well, how to get rid of that problem. And the easiest way to do that is to open a little window. So after, in the future, if that black rook would ever come down to the first rank to attack your king, that would mean that your king would have an escape on the h2 square. And indeed, now black is under a serious threat of the white bishop moving to d4, pinning the black queen and king. If right now the black king would like to move out, it would not quite solve the problems because the white bishop would still move to d4, attacking the black queen, and if the black queen moves away, white would be ready to checkmate by queen to g7. Giving a check on e1 and then the white king escaping from the check wouldn't really solve the problem that black has. At this stage, the best black can do is to give up his rook and block the attack on the queen. Let's move on to our next example. In this position, the whole point is white's pawn that's quite far advanced. And an inexperienced player may immediately touch his pawn, which would mean that you would no longer have a choice but move that pawn, and that pawn has only one choice where to move forward. And that, instead of winning the game, would result in losing the game right away, because it would allow black to give a fork, to give a check, and then when the white king moves, capture your very last pawn, while black would still have a bishop and a pawn, which is typically a winning advantage. Okay, so now you understand why not to push your pawn. But it still doesn't quite give you the answer on what should you move. The first step, though, is sometimes to recognize what not to do, because very often that gives you the necessary hint to the solution of the correct move. Moving your king out of that potential forking problem would only partially solve the situation, because while right now black couldn't win your pawn right away, they could still stop it from future promotion, and this would still give black a winning advantage. Therefore, the only correct solution here is to move your king to e4. And that means your bishop no longer can move to d5, and the only thing black can try is to move the bishop to e8. So if now pawn advances, then again the same trick. But then the correct move is again to move the king to d5, not allowing the black bishop getting on that crucial diagonal timely to stop the advancement of the pawn. And then after a check, the white king can go, for example, to d6 or any of the other dark squares, and then black is indeed helpless in stopping the white pawn from advancing. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, you may remember that I was telling you about forks in one of the previous lessons. And one of the most typical forking opportunities we have in the early or middle part of the game, when you see a black knight being developed to its natural square on f6, controlling the center, and the black bishop being developed to d6, controlling also an important center square. And very often, this enables white to give a fork, attacking two important enemy pieces at the same time, while your knight from f3 protects that pawn. So if the black bishop would capture, the knight would capture the bishop. However, here it's very important to notice that if indeed you would push your pawn up, that at the same time would open up the diagonal of the black other bishop, and in fact that bishop would capture your queen, and that would be a major mistake. Because while winning a knight or a bishop is important, it is certainly a priority to make sure you do not lose your queen. Let's move on to our next example, where white at the moment is a piece down. However, white is able to win the bishop, one of the bishops. In fact, white is able to win either of the black bishops. While white could capture, obviously, the bishop in the corner immediately, you may notice that you have another option, and that is to give a check to black, and then when the black king moves out of that check, capture the other bishop on c8. So the big question is, which one should be a priority? Generally speaking, it wouldn't matter which bishop you capture. However, tactically, it actually is extremely important in this position. One of them is a perfectly good choice, while the other one would lose the game right away. Try to think for a moment and figure out which is the correct one and which is the wrong one. Capturing the bishop after the check would be suicidal because that would allow black to checkmate with a back rank checkmate with rook d1. And that kind of gives it away, tells you by the method of elimination, if you cannot capture the other bishop, you better capture this one. And now the position would be about even. Let's move on to our next example, where white is a pawn ahead. And again, let's think about our priorities. One priority would be to simply protect our pawn. Another one would be to go and be more ambitious and try to checkmate black. You may notice a move like this. I think I told you already in one of the previous lessons about this idea, how dangerous this can be when a queen and a pawn cooperate and white is trying to checkmate with the queen on g7. However, it's very important to always look out for your opponent's best moves as well, not just for your own. And if you do that, you will notice that right now the black queen can capture the pawn on f6, and not only that, white is not ready to give checkmate, white lost his valuable pawn. So therefore, in this case, it was definitely a priority to protect the pawn, and the best way to do that is to move to e7. Let's look at our next example, when again black has set up a trap. At first it seems that, wow, here is a knight, we can capture it. But then again, if you look at a defense for black, or a trap that black may have set, you will realize that the black bishop will move to e5, and that's a check, and then you lose your rook. And instead of winning a knight, you lost an exchange. When you lose a rook for a knight or a bishop, that means you lost an exchange, which means you lost 2 points. So therefore, in this case, capturing a knight is certainly inferior to most other moves. One thing white may do is, for example, play g3 to renew the threat of capturing the knight. And then the next goal would be to activate our king and centralize it so the king perhaps can go and aid white's rook and bishop in attacking the pawn on b7 or some of the other pawns. And here comes our final example of this lesson. Here we go. In this position, black has a clear material advantage. So therefore, exchanging queens is pretty much out of question. How about capturing a pawn on f7? It looks good. On one hand, it gains material, and on the other hand, it threatens with serious checkmate threats along the g7 or f6 squares. The problem is, now black is ready to force immediately the exchange of queens, and then black will have a winning endgame. Therefore, in this case, it's very important not to be content with winning material, with winning a pawn, but look further and search for a better move. And if you do that, you realize that queen d4 check is a much better move because the black king has no moves, and the best black can do is to block with the queen and give up his most valuable piece. Well, I hope you got a little better understanding about priorities and about understanding how crucial it is to constantly look out for your opponent's response before you make your own move. Thank you for listening, and be back next week to listen for more chess advice. So long until next week.